The palace lay in stillness, the hush of dawn casting a golden hue across the marble floors and ornate columns. Jerusalem, the city on a hill, still slept beneath the pale skies. But within the chambers of the king, silence reigned not with peace, but with sorrow. King Hezekiah, once a figure of strength and wisdom, lay motionless upon his bed. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale, and the fire in his eyes had dimmed to a faint glimmer. The room, usually filled with the rustle of royal robes and the scent of incense, now held only the distant chirping of morning birds and the solemn presence of those who waited. The heavy doors creaked open. Isaiah, the prophet of God, entered slowly, his robe brushing the polished floor. His face was grave, his steps deliberate. There was no need for words of comfort, he carried with him a message that would weigh far more than any human kindness could lift. He approached the bed, where Hezekiah's gaze remained fixed on the ceiling. Silent, resigned, as if already halfway to another world. Then Isaiah spoke, his voice steady but quiet, like the first toll of a bell at a funeral. "Thus says the Lord," he said, "set your house in order. You shall die. You will not recover." The words hung in the air, unshaken and final. For a moment, neither man moved. Time itself seemed to pause, as though reluctant to continue. Hezekiah turned his head slowly, away from Isaiah, away from the fading light, away from the world. He faced the wall, bare stone, unadorned and cold. His chest rose in a trembling breath, and from the silence, a sound escaped, soft at first, then rising, a broken cry. The cry of a man who had not feared death on the battlefield, but now trembled before the quiet thief that had crept into his own body. He had been a good king. Or tried to be. He had torn down idols, restored worship, defended his people. He had trusted in God when others fled in fear. And yet, here he was. Alone, frail, sentenced to die before his time. Tears welled in his eyes. Not for the crown he would leave behind, but for the life he had only just begun to understand. He clenched his hands and began to pray, not with the formality of a ruler, but with the raw honesty of a desperate soul. "O Lord," he whispered, voice trembling, remember how I have walked before you in truth, with a loyal heart. I've done what is good in your sight. I've tried." The dam broke. Tears streamed down his cheeks, silent but relentless. There was no pride in this room now. No pomp, no royal decree, just a man, stripped of all but his fragile humanity, clinging to the hope that perhaps his words would not vanish into the void. Outside the chamber, Isaiah walked away slowly, his heart heavy. He had delivered many messages from the Lord before, warnings, promises, judgments. But never had one felt so unbearably final. He could still hear the whispered sobs echoing faintly behind him, and though he knew he had spoken truth, it didn't feel like justice. Inside, Hezekiah continued to weep, not because he feared death, but because he had more love to give. More healing to offer. More life left unlived. And now, in this quiet corner of his final day, he found no crown could protect him, no army could fight this battle. It was just him, his sorrow, and his God. The stillness in the king's chamber lingered, thick like mist, as if even time was afraid to press forward. Hezekiah, his face still turned to the wall, remained locked in prayer. His words were few, but each one carried the weight of a soul stretched thin between life and death. His voice was no longer that of a king commanding armies, but of a child crying out in the night. "O Lord," he whispered again, barely louder than the wind brushing against the curtains. "Remember me." Tears soaked into his pillow as memories flooded his mind. Of walking the temple courts as a boy, watching his father's cold distance from God, and the moment he had decided to change everything. He remembered the day he broke down the altars to false gods, how his hands bled pulling stones from idol shrines. He remembered bringing songs of praise back into the temple, reviving the Passover for the people, opening the doors to the poor, the wounded, the forgotten. He had not been perfect, he knew that. He had stumbled, he had questioned. But he had loved the Lord deeply, fiercely. And now, at the edge of life, that love was all he had left to offer. Outside, Isaiah had reached the outer courtyard, his sandals brushing against the stone pathway worn smooth from years of royal procession. He was deep in thought, his eyes cast downward, when suddenly a presence stopped him in his tracks. It was not a sound, nor a touch, but a stillness that roared. The kind of silence that felt like thunder in the soul. He paused, and the voice of the Lord came to him, not in fire, not in earthquake, but clear, unmistakable, and filled with compassion. "Return," said the voice. "Go back to Hezekiah. I have heard his prayer. I have seen his tears. I will heal him. On the third day, he shall go up to the house of the Lord." Isaiah stood still, overwhelmed. He closed his eyes, feeling the echo of those divine words settle in his bones. 15 more years. The breath of heaven blown back into the lungs of a dying man. It was not just mercy. It was love. Without hesitation, he turned and made his way back toward the king's chambers, robes flowing behind him, a sense of urgency in every step. The guards stepped aside without question, they could see the change in his face, something had happened. Inside the room, Hezekiah remained where he was, the tears still quietly falling, when he heard the door open once again. He turned his head, and there stood Isaiah, eyes full of something different, hope. The prophet approached the bed, kneeling slightly to meet the king's gaze. His voice, when it came, was no longer solemn, but alive with purpose. "Thus says the Lord, the God of your ancestor David," Isaiah said, his words flowing like water over dry ground. "I have heard your prayer. I have seen your tears. Behold, I will heal you." Hezekiah's breath caught. His heart surged. He said nothing, he couldn't. His lips trembled, not with fear, but with awe. Isaiah continued, telling him of the sign he would receive, the miraculous reversal of the sun's shadow, the proof that this was no dream or vision, but a divine intervention. The very laws of nature would bend in answer to one man's whispered prayer. Morning broke over Jerusalem with a clarity Hezekiah had never noticed before. The sunlight didn't just warm the city, it touched it, like a gentle hand waking a beloved child. The sky seemed broader, the air sweeter, and each breath he drew felt like something sacred. Hezekiah stood at the palace window, his hand resting against the cool stone, watching life stir in the streets below. Merchants setting up their carts, children chasing one another between market stalls, old men laughing over bread and stories. All of it, the bustle, the laughter, the very act of being alive, felt like a song he had never truly heard until now. He turned from the window and looked around his chamber, not as a king surveying his riches, but as a man reborn. The bed where he had nearly died, the floor where his tears had fallen, the very walls that had heard his prayer, all were witnesses to a miracle. 15 more years. Not a legend, not a promise for someone else. It was real. Time had been returned to him like a precious scroll unrolled before his eyes. And he would not waste it. Hezekiah did not return to rule with grandeur or parade. He returned with purpose, with eyes open to the pain and beauty around him. On the first day of his recovery, he ordered the palace gates opened. Not for dignitaries or soldiers, but for the sick, the poor, the forgotten. They came hesitantly at first, unsure if a king's favor truly extended to them. But Hezekiah met them not with guarded protocol, but with open hands and eyes full of humility. He knelt beside a child with a twisted leg, whispering words of encouragement. He placed food into the trembling hands of a widow whose eyes hadn't known joy in years. He spent his mornings in the temple, not just overseeing rituals, but joining in the prayers, his voice unashamedly full of gratitude. Word of the king's change spread quickly. This was not a ruler clinging to power or flaunting divine favor. This was a man who had touched the edge of the grave and returned with a heart transformed. He listened more. He forgave faster. He laughed more deeply, not because life was easy, but because he knew now how fragile and holy it truly was. He began writing down songs of praise, reflections of his soul's journey, not for scholars or scribes, but for ordinary people, those who would need reminders in their own dark hours. He spoke of tears that God counted, prayers that did not go unheard, and a love that reached past death itself. In the evenings, Hezekiah would walk the palace gardens, sometimes alone, sometimes with children running at his side. He spoke to them about the stars, about justice, about mercy. Not in the tone of a king commanding obedience, but as a man who had learned what mattered. He spoke less of laws and victories, more of kindness, patience, and the quiet power of faith. Though his crown still rested on his brow, he wore it now with a different weight. It was no longer a symbol of his right to rule, but a reminder of the responsibility to serve. Every sunrise was a gift. Every encounter, an opportunity. Every heartbeat, a chance to love better than the moment before. Far from the palace walls, in a narrow alley tucked between worn stone houses, a young boy sat on the edge of a crumbling step, tracing lines in the dust with his finger. His tunic was patched, his sandals mismatched, and his stomach ached with the familiar hunger that gnawed through even the sunniest mornings. His name was Eli, and to him, kings and miracles were stories from another world. His mother emerged from their small doorway, holding a bowl, wooden, cracked at the edge, but full. Steaming bread, fresh figs, and a handful of lentils. She knelt beside him and set the bowl down. "Eat," she said gently. Eli looked at the food, then at her face. "Where did it come from?" She smiled, brushing the dust from his cheek with her hand. "From the palace." "The king?" Eli's voice rose with disbelief. She nodded. "Yes. He's sending food to the homes where hunger lives." His servants came before the sun rose. They knocked quietly, just as the roosters began to call. "But why would a king give us food?" Eli asked, brow furrowed. "He doesn't know us." Her eyes grew soft as she looked at her son. "Because someone once helped him, Eli. Someone heard his cry. And now he hears ours." All across the city, similar moments unfolded. A man limping home from a long day found a fresh cloak hanging from his door. A widow discovered oil and grain waiting beside her mat. A blind elder, too frail to walk the steep steps of the temple, found the king himself seated beside him one afternoon, speaking words of comfort and singing psalms he had written in his darkest hours. Hezekiah's compassion became a current flowing through the city. It moved in quiet gestures and unseen moments. It lifted people without ceremony, offering dignity instead of pity. The city began to change, not through decree or sword, but through tenderness. Markets grew louder with laughter. Neighbors shared more, judged less. Even those who had once turned from faith found themselves whispering prayers again, unsure if they believed, but daring to hope. In the palace kitchens, cooks rose before dawn not to prepare feasts for nobles but to bake bread for the people. The king himself often joined them, sleeves rolled up, his hands dusted in flour, smiling as if each loaf brought him closer to something eternal. He said little as he worked, but those who saw him knew, this was a man who had tasted death and come back thirsting for love. Servants and scribes began to mimic his generosity. A stable boy gave his shoes to a beggar. A palace guard stayed late to carry water to a sick family near the city gate. These acts were not commanded, they bloomed naturally, like wildflowers after rain. Kindness became contagious. Even across the borders of Jerusalem, news of the king's transformation spread. Foreign traders arrived not just for spices and silver, but to see the city where compassion ruled and the wounded were seen. They carried tales of a ruler who served his people, not from fear or obligation, but from a heart reborn by mercy. And in every corner of the land, those who had once been invisible now stood a little taller. They felt, for the first time, that they mattered, not just to a king, but to the world. The streets of Jerusalem glowed not from gold, but from something far rarer, the light of a compassion that reached outward, wave by wave, touching one soul after another. The sun was beginning its descent behind the hills of Jerusalem, casting long shadows across the palace gardens. It was the kind of golden evening that made the leaves shimmer like embers and the stones glow with the memory of heat. The breeze carried with it the distant songs of children playing and the murmured laughter of families gathered over evening bread. In the midst of it all, King Hezekiah sat beneath an ancient olive tree, his eyes lifted to the sky that had once seemed so far beyond his reach. His robes were simple now, softer, free from the weighty symbols of royalty. A scroll rested in his lap, unfinished psalms, written by his own hand. His fingers, once strong and commanding, moved slowly now, not out of weakness, but with reverence. Each word he wrote was an offering, a memory, a thread in the tapestry of a life extended by grace. Around him, the garden bloomed. Not with exotic flowers imported for royal pleasure, but with herbs and fruit trees planted by the palace children under his guidance. Let the garden grow as the people grow, he had said months ago, and now it was alive with color and purpose. A boy darted between the trees, laughing as he chased a hoop, his bare feet barely touching the ground. Hezekiah watched him and smiled. That boy's mother had once been among the sick who came to the palace gates. Now, her son ran freely through the king's own garden. The king's steward approached, bowing slightly, holding a small bundle wrapped in linen. From the northern village, he said quietly. They've sent you bread and oil, and a letter. Hezekiah took it gently, his hands brushing the steward's. The gesture of thanks from those he had never met humbled him in a way even his illness could not. Unfolding the letter, he read slowly. It was written in a trembling hand, from an elderly woman who had lived through the siege, lost her husband to the sickness, and raised her grandchildren alone. She thanked him, not for gold or food, but for hope. Your prayers saved more than your own life, she wrote. It reminded the rest of us to pray again. Hezekiah's throat tightened. He folded the letter with care and placed it beside the scroll. His heart swelled, not with pride, but with something deeper, quieter. A kind of awe. Not at what he had done, but at what one whispered prayer had set into motion. It had traveled further than he could ever walk, spoken louder than his own voice could ever reach. The breeze shifted, lifting the edge of his robe and rustling the olive branches above him. He looked up, watching the sun sink behind the distant mountains. In the orange and rose-colored sky, he could almost see the shadow of that moment, the day death had stood at his door, and God had answered not with silence, but with life. His thoughts wandered to the boy running through the garden, to the bread in the widow's home, to the blind man who now sat beneath the temple's fig tree each morning and smiled at the sound of birdsong. These were the real miracles, woven into the rhythm of everyday life. The palace bells began to ring softly, signaling the evening prayers. Hezekiah stood slowly, his step steady despite the years that had passed since his illness. He joined the gathering of voices rising toward the heavens, voices full of gratitude, of longing, of joy. Some prayed for healing, some for peace, others for loved ones. And somewhere in the sea of prayer, one voice, his voice, still lingered, echoing through time, not as a relic of desperation, but as a legacy of trust.